The gas station sat on the corner of an old highway, its neon sign flickering against the night, like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to stay alive or give up. The place wasn't fancy, just a row of pumps, a convenience store that smelled of burnt coffee and bleach, and a parking lot with cracks that had long ago stopped being patched. Trucks rumbled in and out, the sound of engines echoing in the stillness of the night. It was the kind of place where people didn't linger unless they had to, a spot where strangers crossed paths in silence, sharing nothing but the glow of fluorescent light and the hum of machines. It was late, almost past the hour when most people with homes had already settled in for the night. A quiet hum of cicadas filled the background, mixing with the distant sound of tires on asphalt. Inside the store, the clerk leaned on the counter, half asleep, the tiny TV behind him buzzing with late-night news that nobody seemed to be watching. Out by the pumps, a man stood filling his car, his movements slow, unhurried, like he had no reason to rush. He wore the kind of calm that made him almost invisible, just another face in a place where no one paid attention. But tension can sit in the air, even when nothing obvious is happening. It was there, hiding under the stillness, waiting. The man didn't know that by tomorrow night, his face would be in the newspapers, not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as something that would make the city sit up in disbelief. For now, he was just another person, filling up his car, thinking about the drive ahead. The officers who would arrive soon weren't looking for trouble either, at least not at first. They had spent their day running the usual calls: petty theft, noise complaints, drunks starting fights in bars. They were tired, restless, carrying that edge that comes at the end of a long shift. But there was also something else, the kind of attitude that grows when power is worn too comfortably. It was in the way they laughed inside the squad car, in the way their words cut sharply when they talked about the people they pulled over. They carried themselves like nothing could touch them. This wasn't a rich part of town. The streets around the gas station carried the weight of years of neglect. Broken streetlights leaned like tired old men, the pavement buckled, and empty houses with boarded-up windows watched the world like blind eyes. People here knew not to expect much, not from the city, not from the police. Tension wasn't new here. It was stitched into daily life, the kind that made people keep their heads down and their words short. The man at the pump lived a different life. He didn't fit the setting, not completely. His car was clean, his shirt pressed, his shoulders straight. There was something careful about him, something that spoke of discipline and patience. People who saw him might not have guessed the years he carried behind his quiet face, or the battles he had fought in places far removed from this cracked parking lot. He had a history that spoke of study, of effort, of refusing to be broken by the weight of other people's assumptions. But here, at this moment, he was just another man standing alone under the harsh lights of a gas station, his presence almost too ordinary to notice. The clerk had seen hundreds like him, faces that came and went, stories never spoken. The officers pulling up saw something else. Maybe it was the way the man looked back at them, unafraid, steady, not flinching the way they expected. Maybe it was nothing at all, just the wrong time, the wrong place, the wrong skin. But once they stepped out of the car, the fragile stillness cracked. There had been moments before this night where the officers had crossed lines without thinking, moments that never made it past a complaint form, if they made it that far at all. A shove too hard, words laced with contempt, cuffs tightened just to prove a point. It had become a pattern so familiar that they stopped noticing. Tonight, they carried that same edge, the weight of authority resting heavily on their shoulders, certain that no one would question their choices. The man, calm as ever, did not raise his voice. He answered their questions with the kind of patience that might have disarmed someone else. But patience is often mistaken for defiance, especially when power feels challenged. The officers circled him with words that cut sharper than their intentions, their voices carrying across the empty parking lot, each syllable charged with something that had little to do with law and order. The night seemed to hold its breath. A gas station clerk peered through the window, uneasy. A passerby slowed down their car, then sped up, unwilling to get caught in the middle of something that felt like it could turn bad. The man at the pump, still calm, didn't know that tomorrow these same officers would stand in front of him again, not on the cracked asphalt of a gas station, but in a courtroom where their voices would no longer carry the same weight. For now, it was just another night in a city that had seen too many like it. A quiet place where normal life wore a thin mask, one tug away from tea, earring. The story that would unfold here wasn't about gas or cigarettes or the routine of midnight stops. It was about power, who holds it, how they use it, and what happens when the roles shift. The gas station lights buzzed overhead, throwing shadows that stretched long across the ground, hinting at the storm that was about to break. The first sign that the night would not stay quiet came in the way the officers stood too close, their words carrying an edge that was sharper than needed. They weren't just asking questions. They were circling, looking for cracks, waiting for a reason to turn a calm moment into something else. The man at the pump kept his voice even, his hands visible, his every move measured. Years of knowing how quickly things could go wrong taught him to tread carefully. But careful doesn't always mean safe, especially when someone else has already decided what they want to see. The officers weren't strangers to this game. They knew how to take a quiet man and twist him into a threat with nothing but the right words and the right tone. Their voices rose a little, one accusing him of looking suspicious, the other demanding answers to questions that made no sense. The man listened, steady, but inside his chest there was a quiet storm. Not fear, but the kind of anger that comes from being treated as less than human again and again, in a life built on proving otherwise. Every word that passed between them thickened the air. The clerk inside the store shifted nervously, pretending to straighten shelves he had already fixed, his eyes flicking to the glass again and again. He knew the signs. He had seen small arguments spiral into something brutal in seconds. The way the officers squared their shoulders, the way one rested his hand too easily near his holster, the way the man's calm refusal to shrink only seemed to fuel them. It was all pointing toward the kind of moment you didn't want to witness, but couldn't look away from. The man wasn't just anyone, though they didn't know that yet. He had lived years of carrying himself with restraint, keeping his dignity intact in spaces that wanted to strip it away. His past was carved with trials most men never saw. He had studied law not only as a career, but as survival, as a shield against a world that too often ignored voices like his. The officers standing in front of him had no idea that the man they were trying to break was someone who spent his days in courtrooms, someone who had memorized every page of the very codes they claimed to uphold. But in this parking lot, none of that mattered. To them, he was just another body they could control, another night they could end with a story to laugh about later. The balance of power sat tilted, heavy, and for a moment the man felt its weight pressing down, on him harder than ever before. He wondered as he stood there how many others had been crushed beneath that same weight, their stories erased before anyone thought to listen. Outside, forces were always there, invisible but crushing. This city carried scars that never healed, scars of poverty, of neighborhoods split by highways, of schools stripped of funding, of families broken by cycles that stretched back generations. The officers carried their own burdens too, though their badges made them look untouchable. One of them had debts piling up, bills he couldn't cover, a marriage that was unraveling. The other had grown up with a father who spat the word weak like a curse, who taught him that control was everything, that being challenged was the same as being disrespected. Both men wore these weights under their uniforms, letting them bleed into their nights on patrol, into the way they handled anyone who stood too firm or looked them in the eye too long. It wasn't just this night building towards something. It was years of small resentments, years of seeing the world through a lens of suspicion and control. And for the man at the pump, it was years of being judged before he spoke, of carrying the burden of proving himself in spaces that never wanted him there. These forces collided now in the harsh glow of the gas station lights, each side holding histories the other refused to see. The confrontation grew sharper. One officer demanded identification, his voice rising, his tone no longer hiding its edge. The man handed it over, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He knew his rights. He knew the limits of their authority. But he also knew how fragile those limits became when someone decided not to respect them. The second officer circled the car, peering inside like he was searching for evidence that didn't exist. The man said nothing, but his silence felt like defiance to them. A car rolled into the lot, headlights cutting across the scene. For a moment the tension broke, and both officers glanced toward the new arrival. But when the driver pulled up to another pump and kept their head down, the focus snapped back. The officers pressed harder, their questions sharper, their bodies closer. The man felt the line between restraint and humiliation thinning. His calm was a mask, but underneath it, his chest tightened, his thoughts tumoring over themselves. How many more times would he have to stand in this position in his life? How many times could he be stripped down, treated like a suspect, before something inside him finally broke? The world outside this gas station had already begun writing stories about men like him, stories that never showed the full truth. The news painted mugshots over achievements, accusations over lives lived with quiet dignity. He had seen it too many times. Neighbors, friends, strangers whose names disappeared after a week in the headlines. He thought about it now, how easily his own life could be rewritten in the same way if this moment spun out of control. But what none of them knew was that the story had already been set in motion long before tonight. The man wasn't just someone they could push around. He wasn't a stranger who would fade back into the shadows. Tomorrow, when he walked into the courtroom, the badges on their chests would mean nothing. Their names would be on the docket, their actions under review. They would stand where he stood now, forced to explain themselves under lights just as harsh, but with no power left to hide behind. The unease grew heavier, stretching out across the cracked pavement. A storm was building, not just between three men at a gas station, but in the city itself. The fragile mask of order was slipping, revealing truths that had been buried for too long. The officers pressed closer, the man stood firmer, and the air thickened until it felt ready to snap. The gas station lights buzzed like angry insects, their harsh glow falling across three men locked in a moment that felt like it could shatter at any second. The air was too still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until breathing feels heavy. The officers stood close now, their voices sharp, words landing like strikes even before their hands moved. The man's car engine hummed softly, a sound that should have been ordinary, but now carried the weight of something about to end. It began with a shove, not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough to tell him he wasn't free to leave. The man stumbled back a step, catching himself, his heart hammering against the calm mask he had worn since the first question. He looked at the officer, his eyes steady, refusing to give him the fear he wanted. That look alone poured gasoline on the fire. The second officer moved in, his hand gripping the man's arm, jerking him away from the pump as if he had already been judged guilty of something neither of them could name. The man spoke, his voice even but strained, reminding them he had done nothing wrong, that he had every right to stand where he was. His words carried the weight of law, of knowledge, but in that moment they only made the officers angrier. To them, his refusal to shrink was defiance, his calm, a kind of mockery. Their grip tightened. One officer barked an order, his tone rising, his chest swelling with the need to show control. And then the line snapped. Hands that should have held restraint moved too fast, too roughly. The man was pulled against the hood of his car, the metal cold against his chest. His face turned toward the buzzing lights, his breath coming faster now. His mind raced, not with panic, but with a flood of thoughts he couldn't stop. How many times had he warned others about this exact moment? How many times had he read the names of men who never walked away from scenes like this? Was this the way his story ended too? Flattened against steel under the weight of hands that saw him as less than human. He fought back, not wild, not reckless, but with the strength of someone refusing to be broken. His arm twisted free, his body pushing back against the grip that tried to cage him. The officers cursed, one striking him across the side, the blow sending sparks across his vision. The sound of flesh against flesh cracked the stillness of the night. The clerk inside the store froze, his eyes wide, his body pressed against the counter as if it could shield him from what was unfolding. The struggle turned chaotic. The car rocked slightly as the man pushed against it, his breath heavy, his muscles straining. The officers shouted over each other, their words a tangle of commands and rage. One reached for his radio, the other for his cuffs, but the man's resistance made every motion frantic. His calm was gone now, stripped away by pain, replaced by raw survival. His heart pounded like a drum in his ears, his thoughts collapsing into one instinct. Don't let them take me. In the frenzy, one officer reached for the weapon at his side, his hand trembling, not with fear, but with the boiling anger of being challenged. The man's eyes caught the motion, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. He thought of his family, of the courtroom where he spent his days, of the quiet mornings when he believed his hard work had built a shield strong enough to protect him. But in that flash, he knew none of it mattered here. The law couldn't save him in this parking lot. The uniform was judge, jury, and executioner, and he was standing on the wrong side of it. The gun didn't fire. Not yet. But its presence was enough to twist everything tighter. The man lunged, grabbing the officer's arm, shoving it away before the weapon could be drawn fully. The second officer slammed him against the car again, rage spilling into every movement. The metal groaned under the force, the smell of gas thick in the air where fuel still dripped from the unattended pump. The scene blurred into violence, a tangle of limbs and shouts, fear and fury feeding each other until it was impossible to tell who was in control. The crime didn't unfold in a single moment. It stretched out, each second bleeding into the next, every motion escalating what came before. A knee pressed into the man's back, a fist landed against his ribs, his body twisting under the weight. The world narrowed to pain and breath, and the crushing sense that this was how it ended. Right here, in the most ordinary place, under lights that flickered like failing stars. And then silence. Not complete, but heavy. The officers panted, their uniforms disheveled, their hands shaking. The man lay still against the hood, his chest rising and falling shallowly, his face pressed to cold steel. For a terrifying second, they thought they had gone too far. One officer stepped back, his mouth dry, his stomach twisting at the sight of the body they had just pinned down. The other muttered curses under his breath, pacing in a tight circle, his fists clenched as if the violence still hadn't drained out of him. The aftermath carried its own chaos. Denial wrapped around them like a shield. They told themselves he had resisted, that they had no choice, that the bruises blooming across his skin were proof of his defiance, not of their rage. Their words tumbled out fast, already forming the story they would tell, the one that would keep their uniforms clean. The clerk inside the store stayed frozen, his heart pounding, torn between stepping outside or locking the door and pretending he hadn't seen anything. The man moved, slowly, painfully, his body stiff but unbroken. He turned his head, his eyes meeting theirs, and in that gaze was something they hadn't expected. Resolve. Even bloodied, even bruised, he looked at them not with defeat, but with a fire that burned too steady to ignore. It was the look of someone who would not let this night be the end of his story. And for the first time, doubt flickered in the officers' chests. They had tried to strip him down to nothing, but he was still standing, and deep down, they knew it would not end here. The crime had unfolded in violence, in the abuse of power that had become routine, but its consequences would stretch far beyond this cracked parking lot. The night smelled of gas and sweat and fear, but also of something else. Change, the kind that creeps in quietly before it explodes. For the man at the pump, survival was more than just breath in his lungs. It was a promise. Tomorrow, he would face them again, but not as the body they tried to break. Tomorrow, the power would shift. The night at the gas station didn't end when the struggle broke apart. It lingered like smoke in the air, clinging to everything it touched. The man drove away slowly, his body aching, his ribs sore where fists had landed. His hands shook on the wheel, though his face stayed calm. He had learned long ago how to hold himself together when everything inside screamed otherwise. In the quiet of his car, though, his chest rose and fell with the weight of what had just happened. He replayed it in his mind. The shove, the blow, the hand reaching for the gun. And with every detail, a deeper truth sank in. It could have ended right there. He could have been another name on the evening news, another story buried in a cycle people would forget too quickly. The officers sat in their patrol car, the silence between them loud and suffocating. Their breathing was still heavy, their hearts refusing to slow down. One of them rubbed his forehead, muttering under his breath, trying to frame what had happened in words that would make sense. The other stared out the window, jaw clenched, eyes darting like a man running through excuses before he had to say them out loud. They told themselves they had done their job, that the man had resisted, that force had been necessary. But underneath, a thread of doubt pulled at them. They felt it in the way their hands still trembled, in the quiet dread that whispered, "What if someone saw?" Back at the gas station, the clerk locked up early. His chest was tight, his throat dry, as if he had swallowed the weight of the whole night. He wanted to forget what he had seen, to tell himself it wasn't his business, but the images wouldn't leave him. The man's face pressed against the hood, the sound of fists landing, the officer's hand reaching for the gun. He sat in his small apartment later, staring at the dark ceiling, asking himself over and over if he should say something, if silence made him safe or guilty. Morning came, but it didn't bring peace. News didn't spread right away, not the full truth at least, but whispers moved fast in neighborhoods where trust in uniforms was already thin. People talked in low voices at diners, in barbershops, in churches. Someone had seen something. Someone had heard about an arrest at the gas station. Someone swore it had been more brutal than the cops were saying. Each retelling carried more anger, more fear, feeding a storm that hadn't yet reached the headlines, but was already brewing in the streets. The man who had endured the night prepared for the day ahead in silence. He stood in front of the mirror, looking at the bruises along his ribs, the swelling near his jaw. He traced them with his fingers, his reflection staring back at him not with weakness, but with resolve. He knew where he had to be. In the courtroom, he would sit in the place of power, the gavel heavy in his hand. And when the officers stepped inside, their uniforms wouldn't shield them. They would be forced to face him not as a man they could shove against a car, but as the judge who would hear every detail of their actions. The officers didn't expect it. When they were told to report for a hearing about use of force, they walked in with their heads high, certain that the department would back them, that it would be another routine review brushed aside. But when they saw him, bruised, steady, seated in the chair that demanded silence and respect, their faces drained of color. The weight of the night before came crashing down in a way it hadn't in the parking lot. They felt exposed, caught, every excuse they had rehearsed falling apart under the gaze of the man they had tried to break. The courtroom wasn't just about them, though. It was about a city that had watched too many stories like this unfold, about families who had buried sons and brothers without ever seeing justice. For some, seeing the officers sit in that vulnerable place felt like balance, if only for a moment. For others, it reopened wounds too deep to heal, reminding them of all the names and faces that never got their day in court. At home, the man's family carried their own burdens. His wife had sat awake all night, waiting for the sound of his car, fearing it would never come. When he walked through the door, bruised but alive, her relief was tangled with fury and sorrow. She touched his face gently, her hands trembling, and asked the questions she had asked too many times before. Why does this keep happening? When will it stop? His children watched him with wide eyes, not fully understanding but sensing the heaviness in the air. They would carry those images too, the sight of their father hurt, the silence that followed, the truth that the world outside their home was not safe for him. The community reacted in waves. Some people rallied, demanding answers, their voices rising in protests and meetings. Others stayed quiet, weighed down by the fear that speaking out would only bring more punishment. The city's leaders tried to balance on a thin line, offering words that sounded careful but empty, words meant to calm without committing to real change. The media circled, their cameras searching for angles, their headlines trimming a complicated story into something quick and consumable. Some painted the man as a victim, others questioned his actions, but none captured the full weight of what had truly happened in that gas station lot. For the officers, denial gave way to fear. Their nights became restless, their thoughts circling back to the man's steady eyes in the courtroom. One of them drank more heavily, trying to drown the memory, his marriage unraveling further with every lie he told to mask his guilt. The other grew angrier, blaming the system, blaming the man, blaming anyone but himself for the spiral he had set in motion. Yet beneath the anger, a quiet shame festered, eating at him in moments of silence when no one was watching. The man carried his own scars, though his posture never showed it. The bruises healed slowly, but the deeper wounds stayed, the ones carved by humiliation, by the reminder that no amount of success or power could protect him from being reduced to nothing in the eyes of those who refused to see his humanity. He stood tall in the courtroom, but in private moments he felt the weight of exhaustion pressing into his bones. He wondered how many more battles like this he could endure, how many more times he would have to prove his dignity in a world determined to strip it away. The crime at the gas station had rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the three men who had stood under those buzzing lights. It had forced people to see truths they wanted to ignore, to confront the way power could twist and break when left unchecked. It had left scars on a community already marked by too many, and it had pulled the veil from a justice system that often seemed blind only when it wanted to be. The aftermath was not loud or dramatic. It was quieter, heavier, a slow unraveling that left everyone changed. For some, it planted seeds of resistance, a determination to demand better. For others, it deepened distrust, a reminder that safety was a fragile illusion. And for the man at the center of it, it was another chapter in a story he never chose, but had been forced to live. A story of survival, of dignity, and of the unshakable truth that even in the face of violence, he refused to be broken. In the weeks that followed, the story of the gas station became something larger than the bruises on one man's skin or the panic that lived in the officer's eyes. It was retold in newspapers, whispered in coffee shops, dissected on television panels by people who had never felt a badge press against their chest or a pair of cuffs bite into their wrists. Yet beneath all the noise, the truth of that night clung to those who had lived it, refusing to let go. The courtroom hearings stretched on, each day pulling the officers deeper into the spotlight they had never wanted. Their words, once loud and commanding, sounded smaller under oath. Their justifications faltered against the weight of evidence, the testimony of the clerk, the bruises documented by doctors, the inconsistencies in their own reports. They shifted in their seats, their uniforms stripped of power in a space where silence meant submission. For the first time in their careers, they were forced to face a world where their version of the story wasn't automatically believed. The man who presided over their hearing did so with a calm so sharp it cut deeper than anger ever could. His voice carried the weight of law, measured and steady, but behind his eyes was the memory of steel against his chest, fists against his ribs. He did not let that memory rule him, but it lived there, shaping every decision he made. When the final verdict came, it was not everything the community had hoped for, nor was it as light as the officers had prayed for. Suspensions, loss of rank, mandatory retraining. It was accountability, if not the full justice that some believed the night had demanded. For the officers, the consequences reached further than the courtroom. One left the force within months, unable to bear the stares from colleagues, the whispers from neighbors who had once respected him. The other clung to the job, bitter, convinced that he had been betrayed by a system he thought would always shield him. His anger festered, but his influence was broken. No longer was he untouchable. Both carried the stain of that night, not on their records alone, but in the way they were seen, in the way even silence around them felt heavy. The man's life too changed in ways both visible and hidden. He returned to his bench with the same straight posture, the same calm authority, but those who knew him well could see the difference. The lines on his face seemed deeper, the pauses between his words longer. He had always understood the fragility of justice, but now he had lived it in a way that stripped away any remaining illusions. His family carried it too, his wife watching him leave each morning with a fear she no longer tried to hide, his children asking questions about fairness that he struggled to answer without breaking their innocence. In the community, the case left cracks that would not easily heal. Some felt vindicated, believing at last they had seen officers held to account in a system that so often protected them. Others felt betrayed, seeing the punishment as too small, another reminder that the scales of justice still tilted unevenly. Protests rose, not with the fury of riots, but with the persistence of voices refusing to quiet. Meetings were held, policies debated, promises made by city leaders who tried to mend trust with words that didn't always match their actions. The story reached beyond the city too, carried by headlines and social media into homes across the country. It became another point in the ongoing debate about power, race, and justice in America. Some argued it proved the system could work, that accountability was possible. Others saw it as proof of how deeply broken it remained, how even when truth was undeniable, the punishment rarely matched the harm. The man at the center of it all became a symbol, though he never asked for it. His face used in articles and speeches, as if his pain belonged to everyone now. In private moments, he wrestled with that. He wondered if survival had made him stronger or simply more tired. He thought about the thin line between dignity and despair, about how many men before him had crossed it and never returned. He thought about the officers too, not with forgiveness, but with a heavy understanding. They were not monsters, not demons born cruel. They were men shaped by power, by fear, by the permission to believe their authority placed them above consequence. And that, he realized, was the deeper crime. The way a system could mold ordinary men into enforcers of something far more dangerous than law. The broader lesson lingered. Power unchecked always turns, twisting into violence, feeding on silence. The night at the gas station had shown in the most brutal way how fragile the promise of justice could be. It had exposed the cracks not just in two officers, but in a society that allowed them to believe they could act without question. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about control, about prejudice, about the way human beings justify harm when they convince themselves it is necessary. And yet, within all of it, there was a kind of resilience. The man had not been erased. His story had not been buried. He had stood in both positions, pinned against a car by force and seated in judgment by law, and he had lived to carry both truths. His survival was not just his own. It belonged to everyone who had been told to stay silent, everyone who had been told to bow their heads. It was proof, however fragile, that dignity could survive even the sharpest attempts to break it. In the end, Justice was not perfect, nor complete. It rarely is. But it left behind questions too large to ignore, questions about what it means to hold power, what it means to use it, and what it means to stand against it. It left behind stories told in quiet voices at night, stories of fear and survival, of anger and hope. And it left behind a man who, despite bruises that had long since faded, carried with him a truth that no courtroom could erase. Power may crush, but it cannot define. The world kept moving after that night, as it always does. Gas pumps still hummed, neon signs still flickered, and people still stopped for fuel, without knowing what had once unfolded there. But for those who lived it, for those who heard it, the story remained. A reminder of how close we all live to the edge between order and chaos, between justice and abuse, between silence and truth. And in that reminder lived the uneasy hope that telling the story might keep it from happening again, even if just for one more night.